I co-founded the Psychedelic Studies Forum with colleague Itamar Shapira, who's a third-year medical student with interest in psychiatry, and the help of Maggie Gossage and Danny Reyes. And today we welcome Dr. Rick Doblin, founder and executive director of the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS. Judging by the interest and turnout, I'm sure most of you know about Rick and MAPS, so in the service of giving us maximum time, I'll just share a quick bio and then we can jump right in. So Rick received his doctorate in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, where he wrote his dissertation on the regulation of the medical uses of psychedelics and marijuana, and his master's thesis on a survey of oncologists about smoked marijuana versus the oral THC pill and nausea control for cancer patients. His undergraduate thesis at New College of Florida was a 25-year follow-up to the classic Good Friday experiment, which evaluated the potential of psychedelic drugs to catalyze religious experiences. He also conducted a 34-year follow-up study to Timothy Leary's Concord Prison Experiment and studied with Dr. Stanislav Grof, and was among the first to be certified as a holotropic breathwork practitioner. His professional goal is to help develop legal context for the beneficial uses of psychedelics and marijuana, primarily as prescription medicine, but also for personal growth in otherwise healthy people, and eventually to become a legally licensed psychedelic psychotherapist. He founded MAPS in 1986 and currently resides in Boston with his wife and 3 children. Okay, thank you, Rick, for coming on. We've allotted Rick an hour to talk with at least 15 minutes of Q&A. Please save your questions for Q&A until the end, and you can post them in the chat. Okay, without further ado, Rick, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm so glad to be speaking to you today. You know, for the longest time, Michael and Annie Midhofer, who are our lead psychiatrist therapists, they were doing research out of Charleston, South Carolina. So when we figured that people heard that psychedelic research was happening in Charleston, you know, they would think it's happening everywhere. But we also think the same way about Birmingham. If it's happening in Alabama, then it's really, you know, become mainstreamed and accepted. And so we're hoping to really make this, and it is, bipartisan and throughout the entire United States. And I'm very impressed with the work that you guys are doing in Birmingham. So what I'm going to do is give you a bit of the background and history and phase 3 results and where we're going from there, and then look forward to questions. So I will start to share my screen now. All right, let me just view. All right, here we go. So this was the paper Nature Medicine that we published May 10th, 2021, about the first of our phase 3 studies. And we have now accrued 88 out of the 100 people in the second phase 3 study, which we think will be done by October. So this paper was many years in coming. It was well received, and we were able to get some really good coverage in the New York Times. This was an inside paper. Then this was an article on the front page, both about our work and the psilocybin work. And then Scientific American talked about it, and it got really widespread coverage. And I think the message here, MDMA shows new promise for trauma, but the drug alone is not a cure. That's the really important message, that it's therapy, that the drug makes more effective, but it's really therapy. Now, Science, at the end of the year, has a list of the breakthroughs of the year. And here's what, that 1 winner and 9 runner-ups. And MDMA was one of the runner-ups.
Every year, Science chooses one fantastic discovery as its breakthrough of the year. Before we get to it, here are a few of the runners-up. In 2021, psychedelic drugs got a big boost in mainstream medicine. One major study found that patients with post-traumatic stress disorder improved so much on the drug MDMA in talk therapy that 2/3 no longer had the disorder after 2 months. The results brought excitement and caution. Nearly all participants correctly guessed that they had received the drug rather than the placebo, perhaps due to its psychoactive effects that might have enhanced their expectations and their odds of improving. Still, if another ongoing study can confirm these results, the treatment may be up for approval by the US Food and Drug Administration as early as 2023.
There. So we were really pleased to see that. And what made that especially appreciated is that in 20 years before, Science published this article about how MDMA caused Parkinson's and would hurt dopamine. And the editorial by Alan Leshner said, taking MDMA is like playing Russian roulette. They later had to retract that article because they had mistakenly given methamphetamine instead of MDMA to the primates. They killed a bunch of them, and we had challenged them, and it took them a year or so trying to replicate their findings, which they could never do. And then they did an autopsy on the animal and found it was methamphetamine. So it was just especially appreciated by us that Science, the same journal that should have never published that paper because there was a lot of indications it wasn't, something was wrong with it, that they went ahead and published it. So this was now, 1959, Carl Jung, shortly before he died. We need more psychology. We need more understanding of human nature because the only real danger that exists is man himself. He is the great danger and we are pitifully unaware of it. We know nothing of man, far too little. His psyche should be studied because we are the origin of all coming evil. I think it's a really powerful quote. You think what's going on in Afghanistan, in Ukraine right now, and in so many places of the world. Natural disasters are not evil, but what humans do to other humans, what humans do to the planet, we can say some of that is evil. So how do we address that? And this sort of speaks to me of the importance of psychedelic research, and also importance of this sort of mystical sense of how we're all connected, which we can get in many ways, not only psychedelics, the astronauts get it from looking at the Earth from space. In a way, the whole world got it through COVID to realize how interconnected we are. Also through climate change. We are more and more understanding how we are all interconnected, but we're not really operating as a collective in that way. We're a lot of special self-interest. So we really need to study the psyche, and I think get down to the basic sort of core aspects of our psyche. And also Abraham Maslow in his hierarchy of needs, many people know that and learned it in school in psychology with self-actualization as the top. But actually near the end of his life, he changed that and put self-transcendence above self-actualization. It's really in service to others, going beyond our narrow sense of self. And so I think that's this transformation that humanity needs to make as a whole. We need a more spiritualized humanity operating from a more basic understanding of how we're all connected, and that then we can actually appreciate the differences rather than be scared by them. So I think we can have both a deeper understanding of our commonality and a deeper appreciation of our individuality. Stan Grof, psychedelics are to the study of the mind, what the microscope is to biology and the telescope is to astronomy. Father Bruno was burned at the stake in part for believing what was seen through the telescope, that the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. He said one of the most incredible, courageous things I've ever heard to the Inquisition that sentenced him to burn at the stake. He said, your fear in sentencing me is greater than my fear at being sentenced. Later, I read this, Brian Murescu, who wrote The Immortality Key, and what he said is that Father Bruno was also heretical because of experiential plant medicines. He wasn't really only about challenging the religious dogma, but he was also challenging the religious hierarchy in a way that put religious officials between people in their own direct spirituality. Now, this is 1990. This is me and Timothy Leary, and this was at a benefit for MAPS. And Ram Dass and Ralph Metzner and Tim and Laura Huxley and Andy Weil and Dennis and Terrence McKenna and others were all there. It was fantastic. And so after Tim spoke, there was question and answer, and I went up to him and I said, what advice can you give us for those of us who are trying to work with the government to bring back psychedelic research and to, mainstream psychedelics? What advice do you have to give to us about dealing with the government? So Tim said, fuck the government. He said, I am so far past asking for permission from them, but I'm glad you're doing it. And so that's where he held up my hand. And so this felt like a little bit of the passing of the baton to the next generation to try to start research, which Tim had clearly given up on 27 years before when he left Harvard in 63, or was kicked out. So here's just a reflection of the incredible progress that has been made. Web of Science Psychedelic Publications. What you can see is that it picks up in the 60s. The peak, an early peak is around 1970. That's when the backlash to the 60s happened. That's when the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. And then you see a gradual diminishment of papers over the next 20 years. And most of those papers are papers about the harms of psychedelics, about LSD causing chromosome damage or MDMA neurotoxicity. And then the papers don't start changing until 1990. And that was Rick Strassman getting permission for his first study with DMT. And then in 1992, FDA opened the door to psychedelic research in a formal way with a project that Charlie Grove and I had on MDMA. And then it's increased ever since. So this is just graphic evidence that we really are in the renaissance of psychedelic research. We have a police officer, to give you an example of how far we've come. Sarko is a police officer who's also a psychotherapist. And he's going through our psychotherapy training program in order to give MDMA-assisted therapy to police officers with PTSD. And his police chief actually gave him permission to participate in our protocol where we give MDMA to therapists as part of their training. And that was filmed by a documentary team working on a documentary about Sarko's transformation from a police officer psychotherapist to a police officer psychedelic psychotherapist. And some of that footage was sold to Netflix for the documentary that's coming out in July on Michael Pollan's book. So we're going to be sort of presenting symbolically to the American public, the world public actually, that we're trying to transcend the us and them between, the police and the underground psychedelics. Now we're overground, and now police are learning how to help other police officers. So 35 years of psychedelic science. Actually, it's 36 years now from 1986 when I started MAPS. This is beautiful, beautiful, created by Alex Gray. And it's his interpretation of the MAPS logo. And as you can see, the hands are in the foreground, the sort of swirly psychedelic bubbles are in the background. And the emphasis here is that it's people helping people. It's really psychotherapy that the psychedelics make more effective. So we really want to put the human, helping humans as the foreground. And that's what this illustrates. Now, MAPS is a nonprofit psychedelic research and education organization that I started in April of 1986. The MAPS Public Benefit Corporation is our pharmaceutical arm, and that was started in December 2014. And now we've got about 155 or so people, around 35 are at the nonprofit, and the rest are at the Public Benefit Corp. And we are going to be expanding dramatically in the Public Benefit Corp and also in MAPS as we move towards what we hope is going to be FDA approval of MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. But the virtuous circle here is that people donate to MAPS, get a tax deduction. MAPS invests in the Public Benefit Corp. MAPS is the 100% owner of the Public Benefit Corp. The Public Benefit Corp will do the research, and if we get approval, it will be the vehicle that will market and commercialize MDMA. So we wanted to basically innovate in two ways. One is, or many ways. The first two were innovating psychedelic assisted therapy and trying to move that through the FDA. But the other is, how do you market pharmaceutical drugs? The profit motive, the for-profit companies are not acting in the best interest of the patients. They're acting in the best interest of their shareholders. And so If you look at America, the average healthcare costs, highest in the world. Our outcomes are down like 40 or 50 on the countries. So I feel that the profit maximization motive in healthcare produces pretty warped outcomes. So what we're trying to do is a pharma company that maximizes public benefit, not profits. So this is our virtuous circle. Now we have reached this point though, where we need so much money that it's been difficult to get it all from donors. So we do have this, what we're calling the Vine Ventures investment vehicle. It is for investors, but it's not the kind of normal returns that venture capital people want. It sunsets after 10 years. We're trying to raise 70 million that way, and we've got about 45 of the 70 million so far. Now, how is it that we can actually make a profit selling MDMA and take investors? Because MDMA is in the public domain. The reason is here. 1984, Ronald Reagan signed a law to provide, among other things, it provided incentives for developing drugs that are off patent. And those incentives are called data exclusivity, which means that the sponsor has exclusive use of their data for 5 years. If you do pediatric studies, which we're required to do, we get another 6 months, blocks a generic competitor from applying to the FDA till 5.5 years is over, and takes the FDA around 6 months or more to review the application. So in essence, there'll be 6 years of data exclusivity. The beauty of it is that it's fundamentally different than a patent, and that if anybody else wants to generate their own data, they can. And we make it easier by all the progress we made with the FDA, by publishing all of our protocols, our studies, our data. So all we have is exclusive use of our own data. Now, data exclusivity in Europe is 10 years, and if you do a new indication, it makes it to 11 years. So this is the vehicle, in a sense, by which we will have a monopoly on if we're approved, for a certain period of time. I don't think anybody else is going to be trying to do research with MDMA. Rather, what they'll do is try to develop MDMA-like drugs and patent them and try to move them through the system, and then say they have various advantages over MDMA, which remains to be seen. So our public benefit model, starting from 12 o'clock, it's about maximizing therapeutic outcomes for each patient, not profit. It's about sharing all of our findings instead of creating IP protection. In the late 80s, early 90s, I contacted a patent attorney to develop an anti-patent strategy for uses of MDMA, which we have basically learned, if stuff's prior art, you can't patent it. So we try to make stories of MDMA that have been used for any number of different things, usually in the underground markets, but people write these stories about what MDMA has been good for them, and that will block somebody from getting a use patent on that. We want to create an ethical practice to serve as a model for the for-profit industry. What that means is we're supportive of for-profits. The scale of the need is so great. The access to capital for for-profits is in excess of the access to philanthropic money. And so we're very supportive of them, but we want to hold them in check. And some of the things that for-profit pharma companies do, overbroad patents, things like that, are not really a good idea. And so we're not supportive of that portion of what they do, but we are supportive of for-profits. One of the biggest changes here down at 6 o'clock is we're in favor of drug policy reform to provide legal access to MDMA for all purposes. It should be legal. I think people have a right to adjust their consciousness. It's a fundamental violation of human rights to have drug war and prohibition. Some people, I think many people in the for-profit psychedelics community are worried that if you could just legally buy it, do it with your friends, or even do it with people that have learned peer support from MAPS and other groups, that would be bad for the business model. Personally, I think it's good for the business model. I think that the more it's destigmatized, the more people have access to this. Those that have real issues many of them, even more of them, will say, I want to go to the clinics with the trained professionals. They can figure out which psychedelic to give me at which sequence, and it'll be covered by insurance. On the other hand, if it's bad for the business model, I don't care. I mean, it's something that is a fundamental human right, and so we're deeply committed to drug policy reform. But drug policy reform should be accompanied with harm reduction and meaning pure drugs, drug checking, information, honest drug education, and psychedelic peer support, like we do at Burning Man and elsewhere with our Zendo project, where people often take psychedelics, and some of them have stuff emerge that is difficult for them to deal with, and they don't know what to do. And so we have this project with hundreds of therapists every year coming to volunteer to support people who are having difficult experiences. So that's the kind of thing we need for drug policy reform. It also means that we're supporting personal and spiritual growth. If it were just left as a medicine, it's only things that are in the DSM, diagnosable illnesses. So, for example, if we want to do research in couples therapy, which we do, we're not going to get FDA to approve MDMA for couples therapy because it's not a disease. And yet it's one of the best uses of MDMA. So that'll be a challenge. How do we get that covered by insurance? Now, we also want to address conflict between couples. As I said, couples and culture. There's Israelis and Palestinians doing ayahuasca and MDMA together. And we're studying that with Leo Roseman and Robin Card-Harris at Imperial. Now he's at UCSF. They've published the ayahuasca interviews with people. They were going to do a ceremony in Spain, but COVID stopped it. That'll happen soon to take Israelis and Palestinians to Spain for ayahuasca, and we're going to be working on the MDMA portion of that. Now, we've raised over 130 million in donations and grants since our founding. That's a lot of money. But in the last 2 years, for-profits have raised way more. You can see how much more they've raised. It's rather astonishing that they've been able to raise around 1.5 billion. Now I think it's actually closer to 2 billion. Now, what I'm going to tell you is the results of a large number of people's work. This is maps our various departments. This is the Benefit Corp with all their various departments. This is way out of date as far as all the people in the Benefit Corp. And I want to share that we have just a week and a half ago hired somebody to help us with commercialization and patient access. So, we know science, we know drug development. My PhD was on FDA drug regulation. I should add that our 3 kids have flown the coop and are out of the nest. They're not living here as part of my bio. But what is so exciting is this new person that has joined the Benefit Corp. And he was the number 2 person at Moderna for commercializing the Moderna vaccine all over the world, and sold tens and tens of billions of dollars, and built up the company, their commercialization department from 2 people to 150 people plus. The reason he's looking for a new job or is working for us now is that the head of Moderna decided that Pfizer, which they decided had an inferior product, sold more billions than Moderna. But that's because they had infrastructure, they had people all over the world, they had salespeople. So whether Pfizer is an inferior product to Moderna, they did sell more. So anyway, we benefit from that, and we are so lucky to have Mike Millett is his name. Now, MDMA was invented in 1912. Merck had no idea what they were doing. They were not looking for MDMA. They were trying to evade a competitor's patent, and they patented everything on the new route that they were going, and one of them was MDMA. They never tested it in humans, and it was rediscovered in the mid-1970s by Sasha Shulgin, who resynthesized it and experimented with the drug himself. Then he gave it to his wife, and he's made hundreds of drugs, but those that they thought were valuable, they would give to a group of 12 people. They would meet once a month or something like that and test new drugs. And if the 12 people, they would gather all that information, and then they would think they'd have a more balanced perspective on what the drug does. And if they thought it had particular therapeutic potential, they would move it to therapists. And so Leo Zeff is known as the secret chief. He was planning to retire. He's a clinical psychology PhD, did all sorts of work with Ibogaine, with LSD, with other things. He was fantastic. And then when he was told about MDMA by Ann and Sasha, and he tried it. He thought this has incredible potential. So he started training quite a large number of therapists and psychiatrists in MDMA therapy. And from middle 70s to the early middle 80s, around 500,000 doses were used in therapeutic settings, much of it manufactured at MIT in the labs late at night. So it was very pure, very good. But it leaked out of these circles and it became ecstasy, sold in a more public way, particularly at the Star Club in Dallas, where 800 numbers, you could buy it over the bar, and big dance culture. There's a documentary that's being made about the Star Club. But this has really attracted the attention of Lloyd Bentsen, Senator of Texas, and that led to DEA trying to criminalize MDMA in '84. If you see in the picture, that's me there on the left. Spy on the DEA before I walk in the door during this 30-day public comment period to ask for a hearing. Once the DEA moves to criminalize, they have 30 days. They have to put it in the Federal Register, and there's a 30-day public comment period. They only knew it as ecstasy, so they were really shocked that there was this whole underground community that had been using it for therapy and that they were preparing for years, they meaning me and others. So we were ready, and we got the hearing, and we were winning the hearing. And winning in the court of public opinion, which freaked out Gene Hayslip here, who was the head of DEA's diversion control and research group. So he declared emergency scheduling in the summer of '85. The interesting thing here is that he had no authority to do that. The people that were busted in the first year all got free because the Attorney General had the power to emergency schedule, but had never been subdelegated down to the DEA. And so they didn't pay attention to that. So the first move to criminalize MDMA was itself illegal. And I think that's really ironic. The other sad thing to say is if you add up all the veterans and all the other people that committed suicide over the last 37 years since MDMA was criminalized, and how much help we could have given them, is the scale of this tragedy is enormous at this move to criminalize, particularly since the judge, DEA administrative law judge, later said that MDMA should be available Schedule 3 as a medicine. But this was me. So we started MAPS in '86. To my right is Debbie Harlow. She was the one that gave me MDMA, told me about it in '82. And she was also the board of directors of the nonprofit before MAPS that we used to struggle against the DEA. So once MAPS was started, we had 28-day toxicity studies in the dog and the rat. Dave Nichols at Purdue had made us very pure MDMA. I paid him $4,000 for a kilogram. He had a good yield. We got about 1.5 kilograms. We still have some of that MDMA today. That's 37 years old and is still 99.9 something pure. It's incredible, stable molecule. But with that, with the animal studies and the MDMA, we worked with researchers, Jonathan Cole at Harvard, others at UCSF, at 5 different universities. All of these protocols were rejected by the FDA. So the early days were very frustrating, and that's also where this rise of the narrative that MDMA causes brain damage, holes in the brain, serotonin, neurotoxicity, major functional consequences, as I said, culminating in the supposed MDMA hurting dopamine and causing Parkinson's. But it was extremely frustrating that we couldn't start any MDMA research. That changed in 1992 when the FDA and the National Institute on Drug Abuse had a formal hearing to decide whether or not to reopen the door to psychedelic research. This was a group called the Pilot Drug Evaluation Staff that was looking for ways to expedite drug development, and they needed things to practice on. And so they took on the psychedelics from the Paul Lieber at the FDA, who'd been blocking psychedelic research for 20 years. And we went in there to do a study with MDMA for cancer patients with anxiety. FDA decided that they would open the door for psychedelic research, but that they would not permit us to use all the information that had been gathered in non-FDA settings. So they said, you can't start with cancer patients, you have to start with a phase 1 dose response safety study, which we did. And then that took us through much of the 90s. Then Charlie decided that MDMA was too controversial and he would switch to psilocybin. So he helped start psilocybin for end of life. And I was sort of moving on to PTSD. So this was a study we started in Spain. This is the first study ever of MDMA for PTSD. The tragedy here is that George Accardi, the NIDA-funded MDMA neurotoxicity researchers, went to Spain and gave some exaggerated stories of how damaging it was. And this upset the Madrid anti-drug authority. And they shut the study down after some major positive media where they learned about it for political reasons. Now that was really heartbreaking. But in 2000, I also met Michael Mithoefer at the world's first ayahuasca conference in San Francisco, organized by Ralph Metzner. And so we decided to very quickly work on MDMA for PTSD. And we got approval from the FDA, but we had 7 different IRBs reject or refuse to review our protocol. We were first approved by the Western IRB, the largest non-local IRB. And the month after we were approved, they sent us a letter saying, we're revoking approval. This drug is way more dangerous than you led us to believe. And they'd spoken to Una McCann, George Accardi's wife. And we said, no, we didn't mislead you at all. And we argued it out with them for a long time. And they eventually said, it's not about the science, really. It's about the politics. And here's your money back. We're not, IRBs, when they reject your protocol, they never give you your money back. These are sort of private for-profit IRBs, but we got our money back. But then the next IRB you need to go to, you need to tell what happened with the first IRB. So we went through 7. Then I realized MAPS is an institution. We could just start our own IRB. You know, the HHS has rules, what you need to do, how do you start? So we figured, okay, we can start our own IRB. But before we did that, once I relaxed and knew we're going to get this study started, we had FDA approval. I said, I'm going to try one more time with one of these non-local IRBs. And I figured, I scanned the names, and there was one called Copernicus. And I figured if any IRB is going to be sympathetic to the political pressure from politics and religion to stop science, it would be the Copernicus group. So I called them and I said, I need you to live up to your name. And in the end, they did. They approved the study and we were able to go forward. Ironically, a few years ago, the Western IRB bought Copernicus Group IRB. And so I was a little bit worried about that. But then I got an invitation to an annual conference in Seattle of the Western IRB. And they had me present about MDMA research. And the night before at a party there, I met this guy that actually wrote the letter giving us our money back. And I said, can I mention this? You know, I'm really glad to be here. And he said, no, we got some of our board members, too controversial. Don't do it. And in the morning, he felt bad. He said, yeah, you can go and mention it. So I told the whole history of the Western IRB acting politically and not scientifically, and how every one of the people on the review board should really focus more on the science. And so that was really satisfying to see this full circle, or on the same like with science, that they're supporting our research when they tried to blast it 20 years ago. But we had our end of phase 2 meeting 30 years after I started MAPS. From 86 to 2016, it took 30 years to get all the data that we needed for the end of phase 2 meeting. We went there with 5 people. All of these people are still working for MAPS now. And we were given permission to move to phase 3. Now, when you move to phase 3, you have an option as a pharmaceutical sponsor to go through a special protocol assessment process called the SPA. And that's where you negotiate every aspect of the phase 3 design, your statistical analysis plan, all your measures, everything else that the FDA would want to know in order to get the drug approved or not. And because it takes a lot of time, most pharma companies don't do this, and they don't need to. But because we've got challenges in the double blind, which you heard in the science little segment there that I played, I felt it was necessary. So we went through the special protocol assessment, and we came out the other end with an agreement letter And that's a legal document that formally binds FDA to approve MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD if we have 2 statistically significant phase 3 studies and no new safety problems arise. This is the protocol that was approved for phase 3. And we were approved 2 100-person phase 3 studies. This is 3 8-hour day-long sessions, roughly 3 to 5 weeks apart. And there's 12 90-minute non-drug psychotherapy sessions, 3 before the first session for preparation, 3 after each session for integration. And the first session is, you get randomized either to the top row or the bottom row. So people get inactive placebo all 3 times, or they get MDMA. The first one is 80 milligrams. 2 hours later, we give half the initial amount to extend the plateau. We think longer is better. A lot of these for-profit companies are trying to say, oh, let's make a shorter acting this or that. Now, whether that's going to be therapeutically any better, I have my doubts. And I also think if we get great outcomes, we can get the insurance companies and others to support what we do, which is what will work. If it works, they should support it. We shouldn't have to squeeze what we're doing into the traditional model. So then there's a discussion before the second session, and most everybody decides, more than 90%, to go to a fuller dose, which is 120 milligrams, followed 2 hours later by 60 milligrams. And most of those people stay on that for this third session as well, but there is some flexibility there. And then the follow-up, the primary outcome measure, is 2 months after the last experimental session. So this is what's been approved for phase 3. It's also been approved in Europe. So shortly after we got this special protocol assessment agreement letter, we got breakthrough therapy status from the FDA, which means we have special meetings with the FDA, shorter review time. It's really a breakthrough. It's the best designation you can get from FDA. So we got that. And then we started working with the European Medicines Agency. They've agreed to accept the FDA data. They required a pivotal 70-person phase 3 study that's the same comparison of therapy with inactive placebo versus therapy with active MDMA. And they said that we should enroll some refugees and migrants. Now, this was years ago, but we all know what's going on in Ukraine with the tragedy of millions of refugees and migrants who are, many of them, deeply traumatized, and some of them will develop PTSD. So we're still raising money for Europe, but we are starting to do the work in Europe. We're doing these phase 2 lead-in studies, open label studies, where therapists are treating PTSD patients, but it's mainly for the training of the therapist. So we monitor the videotapes of their therapy sessions. And so we're using 7 countries, around 10 sites in 7 countries. We're enrolling people in the Netherlands and the Czech Republic, and we're just soon to start in Germany, Norway, and England. And then we're still screening soon for Hamburg, Lisbon, and Cardiff. But we're very excited about globalizing. If you have FDA and EMA approval, almost all the countries of the world will go ahead and approve your drug, other than Russia, China, and Japan, where we have to do studies there. What does this drug do? It releases serotonin, norepinephrine, dopamine, releases these hormones, oxytocin, oh my God, oxytocin, oops, prolactin, vasopressin, and so it's what's called a dirty drug. It does a lot of different things, but there's been an interesting study that Doblin at Hopkins has done with octopuses that are solitary creatures around 600 million years ago or so. Humans and octopuses diverged. Octopuses are very solitary creatures, and this is the experiment. On the left, you put an octopus where there's doors into 2 different chambers. One, you've got a captured octopus, the other, you got a captured inanimate object. And under all switching of the sexes of the octopuses. The octopus spends way more time with the inanimate object, and when it's with the octopus, it's around the periphery. It took a while to figure out. We supplied the MDMA, but they figured out how much MDMA to put in the water. They soak the octopus in the water for 10 minutes. It absorbs the MDMA. They put it back in this chamber, and now all of a sudden, they spend more time with the other octopus, and they're actually entangling their tentacles. And so the pro-social aspects of MDMA are evolutionarily conserved. Octopuses do process serotonin. And so it's a remarkable demonstration that there is something that's pre-verbal about this pro-social aspects of MDMA, which, extrapolating a bit, means to me that when we do the work in adolescents, and then if that works, we have to do 7 to 11-year-olds, that kids who are traumatized, I think, can benefit from MDMA, even if they are not articulate enough to be in a therapeutic setting. But that's the message I get from this octopus study. We'll also publish this paper in Nature, which talked about in mice. So this was the idea that MDMA releases oxytocin, and it opens this critical period for social reward learning. And then it's neuroplasticity, new neural connections are made. So that can help explain why experiences that are relatively fleeting in time can have a lifelong impact. What happens if you got PTSD to your brain? Well, you have a hyperactive amygdala where we process fear. You have reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex where we think logically. It's more difficult to think logically. You're more triggered by things. And there's reduced activity in the hippocampus, which is bad for processing. That's where a lot of memories get processed into long-term storage. So these are kind of some of the changes if people have PTSD. What does MDMA do? The exact opposite. MDMA reduces activity in the amygdala. It increases activity in the prefrontal cortex, and it increases connectivity between the amygdala and the hippocampus to facilitate emotions and memories to be processed into long-term memory. Now, I imagine you've heard from the work in the 60s and also the more recent work over the last several decades with psilocybin and other substances, that there's a correlation between the depth of the mystical experience and therapeutic outcomes. Now, we use the same mystical experience questionnaire. This is just from 2 of our phase 2 studies. 0.6 in all the categories is considered to be a full mystical experience. And you can see that a substantial number of the people did have 60 or greater, 0.6, I mean, mystical experience, but there is no correlation with MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD. So the therapeutic approach is not aimed at trying to help people have a mystical experience. If it happens, it happens. It can be good for other reasons, but it's not correlated with therapeutic outcomes. So what are our phase 3 results? We have to do 2 100-person trials. The first trial, because of COVID, was stopped early. We couldn't enroll any people. So the FDA agreed that they would let us close out the study with just 90 people. And that's the paper that was in Nature Medicine. Since the slide was created, we now have 88 participants accrued. And we think we'll have this interim analysis take place in May. We've been trying hard to really increase the demographics and diversify. So this is a bit of evidence of the direction we're moving in. And the MAP1, which is our first phase 3 study, MAP2 is our second phase 3 study. Basically, 73%, 3/4 of the people were white, and 27% were patients of color or people of color. We've reversed that though in MAP2. So now it's half the people, more than half the people are of color. So we're making progress in our diversity goals. You can just see the various races that is composed of. And we've done it with gender is pretty much stayed the same. this made a little bit of change in the trans non-binary, more than doubled from 2% to 5%. But you can see the 66% male in map 2 so far and 62% in map 1. That's disappointing to us, but we'll keep trying to do that. And then in terms of LGBTQI, we really didn't have much of an effect there. Now, who is in these studies? Veterans get a lot of the attention, but mostly the people that are traumatized are women with sexual assault, domestic violence. So you can see that we have a range of people with different causes. One of the things we learned in phase 2 was that our therapy works regardless of the cause of PTSD. So that meant we could enroll anybody that we wanted to. And of these people, though, 30 out of the 90 principal trauma occurred during childhood. That's substantial. These are people with complex PTSD. The other part is that, and you'll see, people have had PTSD a long time. 1/3 of them have had PTSD for 20 or more years. These people are really, really suffering. Now, unlike many studies of PTSD, we enroll people who previously attempted suicide. So this shows that well over 90% had positive ideation. Serious is harder to describe where the actual line is, but around 40% of the people in our study had serious ideation, and almost 1/3 of them had positive behaviors, like going to a bridge and thinking of jumping out, or any number of different things. So we enrolled the hardest cases. We felt that we needed to enroll people that had PTSD, that had attempted suicide, because if you're not helping the hardest cases, you're not doing what's necessary. Now, this is just a graphic design of the results on the CAPS-5, the Clinician Administered PTSD Scale. The upper is the MDMA group, the blue, and the red is MDMA. And so you can see that there is a substantial difference. They both started at the high place. We're around 44 or so opening on the CAPS. And we're very proud and happy of these results. We also looked at depression. You can see a similar situation, and we looked at functional impairment. Well, these again, much better with the MDMA than by therapy alone. Now, one of our donors owns the New York Mets, and so we use this to explain the statistical significance of our study. 0.05, nobody think it's that significant. In order to get statistical significance, you need 1 in 20, chance, 0.05, that it's due to random factors. If it's 0.5, 1 in 2 chance, that's not significant. But if it's 1 in 20 or more chance that it's no more effective than a placebo, then you can get your drug approved. Now, the FDA has a program called Very Persuasive Robust 0.001, which is 1 in 1,000 chance that the treatment is no more effective than placebo. So that's tremendous. And you think about one study that is 0.05, 1 out of 20, and you multiply that by a separate one, assuming they're independent, that's 1 out of 400. So this robust, very persuasive is even more difficult than having 2 phase 3 studies. And they're, what did we get? Grand slam out of the park, 1 in 10,000, 0.0001. So we were remarkably pleased by that. We think that pretty much guarantees, that we're likely to get approval. But statistical significance can be about minor changes. So what is it that actually has happened? In the group that received therapy plus inactive placebo, 32% no longer had PTSD at the end of the 2-month follow-up. And in phase 2, down below at 23%. That makes sense. There is no good solution to the double blind. Low doses of MDMA make people uncomfortable. It compromises the therapy. The therapy with inactive placebo is even better than, some sort of active placebo or whatever. But 32% no longer had PTSD, and in phase 2 it was 23%. But in our experimental group that got therapy plus MDMA, 2/3 no longer had PTSD, and that was phase 2 was 56%. So we're getting better, and what we've got is on the bottom right is the phase 2 result, 68%. That's after 1 year, and so the 2-month follow-up is for FDA, but the 1 year is for insurance companies, because this is going to be more expensive than normal. We got to justify that it's durable for insurance companies to want to pay. Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote the book The Body Keeps the Score, is the principal investigator of our Boston site. But he was very skeptical. He hadn't worked on phase 2, and he came board on phase 3. And he said, don't work with the dissociative subtype or complex PTSD. They have such attachment issues that you'll end up not getting good results. And we said, no, it seems to us that we will get good results, but more importantly, it seems, more importantly, the people that had the dissociative subtype, the hardest to treat, did the best. And that was what really surprised Bessel. And now that's why he thinks this is so productive of a treatment. So what's the effect size, though? A way to equalize across studies. So Paxil and Zoloft, the only drugs approved for PTSD, and they have small to medium effect sizes or failed studies. We have a 0.91 placebo subtracted effect size. An effect size of 1 is 1 standard deviation from the norm. Now, when you do the placebo subtraction, that's normally because your placebo is a placebo. But in our case, placebo is therapy. So really, when you do that, you're just leaving the effect size of the MDMA by itself. But when you look at the group that received MDMA plus therapy, it's 2.1. So the within subjects effect size is enormous, 2 standard deviations from the norm. So we're really delighted about that. Importantly, the results were distributed across all the clinical sites. It's not that we had a few sites where all the most experienced therapists were and they trained most of the people and it didn't work elsewhere. We did statistical tests and showed that there was no site-to-site variability in that way. This speaks to the quality of our therapist training program. We had about 80 new therapists in phase 3, but I really think it has more to do even with the just therapeutic potential of MDMA. But what does all this mean if we don't have good safety data? So we had really good safety data in terms of adverse events of special interest. We had more suicidal thoughts, behavior, self-harm, minor, though 5 participants in the placebo group and 3 in the MDMA group. But serious adverse events, we had one woman tried to kill herself twice during the study, and another woman felt so disturbed that she tried to check herself into a mental institution to avoid self-harm. And both of these women were in the placebo group, and we didn't have that happen in the MDMA group. No big cardiovascular issues. The one issue was with somebody in the placebo group, and as far as we can tell, the abuse potential, we don't see people, going off to parties and using ecstasy. We don't do blood tests or anything like that, which is only good for a couple of days, but it's difficult work. And many people have said in our study, I don't know why they call this ecstasy. So they don't see it as a fun party drug. So I think we've got a really acceptable abuse liability. The side effects are all greater in MDMA than placebo, but these are the acute side effects. They're non-serious. The biggest ones, muscle tightness, decreased appetite, sweating, feeling cold, restlessness. You can see it's really a very good safety profile. So very small p-value, large effect size, replicated results from phase 2 trials, no site-to-site variability, and a great safety profile, no increase in suicidality. Now, that leads to this one. Now, this was a big multi-year study funded by the Veterans Administration that the lines here, the yellow and green lines, this was studying in about 900 veterans with PTSD the cognitive processing therapy, and prolonged exposure. And you can see on the left-hand side that they started pretty similar. There are two groups. Our two groups started higher because we're working with more difficult people. Our therapy with MDMA was better than prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy. But the more important part is look at the upper right, the dropout rates. The dropout rates of prolonged exposure and cognitive processing therapy are around 50%. And our dropout rate with MDMA was 6.5%. So people stay in treatment. They're not overwhelmed by the confrontation with their traumas. They can work through things. So this we think is, again, it's not a head-to-head study, but it suggests that there's a lot of value here for us to do. The interim analysis for our second phase 3 study will be in May. I'll get a number. All I'm going to get is a number. It's either 0 or some number of people and it represents people we need to add to the study. If it's 0, we just go on. If it's add subjects, that means our power calculations were not the same. It's not as effective as we thought. I doubt that's going to happen. Or the worst is you get the word stop the study for safety or futility. The only other designated breakthrough therapy drug for PTSD, Tonmya by a pharmaceutical company, Tonix Pharmaceuticals, failed in phase 3. It was just a repurposed sleeping pill. There is this expanded access, compassionate use that's going on now. We've got approval for 50 patients. It's in cities where we don't have phase 3, and we're just getting ready to start it. If we do the first 35 and it goes well, we're going to the FDA to apply for hundreds more. This is only necessary before the drug becomes a medicine, as a prescription medicine. There's no control group. The FDA doesn't look at the efficacy data, but they do want to see the safety data. This is just a Gantt chart of our path forward, just to show at the very top, 2022. That's where we think we're going to finish the second phase 3 study. And so all of this just suggests that before the end of 2023, we should have it approved by the FDA. Fortunately for us, the Improving Regulatory Transparency for New Medicinal Therapies Act put some limits on the DEA. The DEA must reschedule within 90 days. If FDA says yes, the DEA can't dilly-dally and take forever. And then we have to reschedule in the states. Half the states automatically reschedule, and the other half have various different programs. To do that, post-approval, what we're hoping to do is to train, the bottom line, 25,000 therapists during our period of data exclusivity, and have 1 million MDMA sessions, which will be roughly 500,000 patients. We think some people will have 1 session, some people will have 3 or 4, maybe the most will have 2, but we shall see. And this is just by year, the number of MDMA sessions that we'll have. Then the other line at the top is the capacity to say that we don't think therapists are going to be working 100% just doing MDMA. The REMS, how is this going to be regulated? And this is providing safety for safety reasons. It's therapy, as I said from the very beginning, and we think therefore that only people that have been trained in our therapeutic method, either trained by us or by programs that we authorize, hopefully, embed this in schools of psychiatry and psychotherapy in the future, so that people become trained in MDMA, psilocybin, ketamine. But we do think it's important that the training, the therapy that was used in phase 3 is something that people should learn. Once it's approved, you can modify and do what you want. But we think that for safety, if people understand the method that we used, and we also do believe that it's very important for therapists to receive their own MDMA experience as a patient. As part of their training, we do have 2 protocols for that. It's going to be a challenge how to work on that and legally make that available post-approval, but we think that we can do that. There'll also be training for the prescribers, and it's only going to be administered under direct supervision and certain safety screening, mainly for blood pressure. And this is modified a little bit, this idea of where limited distribution models to supply MDMA directly to healthcare providers. It's becoming increasingly clear to us that that might not work because of DEA licenses. And so we're thinking of then, we've actually asked the DEA what they think about us sending the MDMA to the patient in a lockbox with an electronic lock and sending the code to the therapist. So the patients get the drug, but they can't access it until they bring it to the therapist, who then have the code and can unlock it. Very fast. Now, we're moving into the VA October 12th, after 30 years, 31 years actually, since 1990, when I tried to introduce MDMA into the VA. On October 12th, the first veteran with PTSD was administered MDMA inside the VA. Rachel Yehuda on February 3rd administered MDMA to the first VA veteran with PTSD in the Bronx VA. She's going to study 2 sessions versus 3 sessions and looking at the 2-month and 1-year follow-up. She's also training therapists. This week, right now, there's a training program for around 60 VA therapists from 18 different VAs around the country, taught by Michael and Annie Mithofer, and organized by Rachel. We just got word from the FDA that they're going to approve a group therapy study by Christopher at the Portland VA. In this study, everybody's going to get an individual session first before they take it together in a group. Ben Kelmendi at Yale is about to do a project where the first time ever that somebody with PTSD will be given MDMA and sent into a scanner to see how they operate. They'll have therapeutic support. They're not going to use a supplemental dose. It's minimal support, more if needed. And so it's the closest legally, ethically, we felt we could get to giving MDMA without therapy. We've done blended MDMA with cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy. This is Candace Monson developed cognitive behavioral conjoint therapy with the VA. Conjoint means couples or therapists, or couples or dyads, where one has PTSD affects the relationship. We did 6 dyads. It was fantastic, better than anything she'd done before. We've raised the money for 60 dyads to be tested in Canada, where she lives, in Toronto, and we're trying to introduce this into various VAs as well. Ann Wagner, Candace's protege, is combining MDMA with cognitive processing therapy. Barbara Rothbaum just got Wounded Warriors grant. The first grant for a psychedelic project ever from Wounded Warriors is for MDMA to combine it with prolonged exposure. Edna Foa, who developed prolonged exposure, is now working with us after saying that MDMA was dynamite in the brain when Michael Mithofer and I met her in 2009. But now she see the way the train is going, and she's going to work to see if she can improve prolonged exposure with MDMA. We did get 12.9 million from the state of Michigan for a marijuana project in veterans. I just want to say that we are doing that, but cannabis for PTSD is palliative, not curative. It needs to be taken every day. Don't take it, your problems come back. But there's a fair number of people that don't want to do the hard work of the MDMA assisted therapy. So we're very interested in exploring it. This is going to be future psychedelic clinics. This just illustrates that the clinics are not going to be just, here's an MDMA clinic, here's a ketamine clinic, here's a psilocybin clinic. People are going to be cross-trained to work in all the different modalities. Once that starts happening, my long-term goal for the last 50 years is to become a psychedelic therapist. So hopefully I will get this psychedelic therapy license. Then we're going to see how we deal with this marketing of MDMA. Are you overwhelmed with anxiety? Talk to your doctor today about MDMA. Ask your doctor if MDMA therapy is right for you. We've kind of made these up for fun. Then there'll be ads for psychedelic therapists. And there's already ads like this for ayahuasca. But I think it'll take a decade of rolling out psychedelic clinics. There'll be 6,000 or 7,000 of these clinics in the United States. And I think by 2035, we're going to move to licensed legalization, which is basically this idea that, like a driver's license, that, if you misbehave, you lose your driver's license. There should be a license. If you misbehave on the use of drugs, then you use your license to buy them. And I think it'll take 2035 and thousands of people telling their stories before we're ready to move into licensed legalization. Then I'll get a license to buy psychedelics legally. And for parents who have children, 23 states have what we call parental override to laws against alcohol use by minors. So I think that's the way it should be psychedelics, that it should be illegal for minors unless your parents or guardians say it's okay. And that just follows what the alcohol is like in 23 states. By 2070, the idea is that we will hopefully have a spiritualized humanity. And I won't be around to see that, but I hope that actually happens. And then I'm going to end with this book by Carl Jung. The best political, social, and spiritual work we can do is to withdraw the projection of our shadow onto others. And if we can do that, we can really see others as equals, and we can move towards dealing with the challenges that we have and living collectively and really trying to make this paradise on earth. And psychedelics, I think, can play a role in that. So that's the overview.
Great. Thanks so much, Rick. So we'll start taking questions through the chat. And in the meantime, Itamar, I think, wanted to kick it off, so you guys can start sending those out.
Our first question is very timely. I'm sure that Rick and maybe some other people are aware of the recently raised concerns on the Cover Story podcast about the safety of MDMA therapy, both in terms of the preservation of boundaries and the depth of pacing of what can be a very intense therapy, and a revelation of sometimes very significant trauma that people hold. There are also concerns that the results that MAPS has been publishing do not necessarily reflect participants' lived experiences. What kind of thoughts or feedback do you have about that, Rick?
Yeah. Well, yeah, so we've had around 365 patients that we have treated. In one instance, at least that's the only one we're aware of, one of the therapists engaged in a sexual relationship with a patient, which is completely unethical. We do have rules against that. We have patient bill of rights. We're trying to do more to prevent that from happening. But it has happened, and so we're condemning that. We're not working with those researchers anymore. The idea of whether the CAPS-5 reflects the lived experience of the patients, it's designed to do that. It's an hour-long interview. It's used. We have a very robust system of independent raters. I think in Cover Story there was some patient that said that she made it seem like her results were better than they really were in order to please the researchers. I suppose that could have happened. There are internal checks within the CAPS to sort of see if people are being honest and accurate. We can only deal with the information that we're given. The CAPS is the most important, or the only, really, it's the gold standard required by FDA and EMA and other regulatory agencies around the world. It's a difficult situation. We do work with the hardest patients, and I think the problems that I heard of in the Cover Story were from patients who felt that the 3 sessions was not enough and they wanted more sessions. And in all the cases, actually, people felt that the therapy ended too abruptly. That's the way that protocols are run. I mean, we must do that. But post-approval, people can get more sessions if they need them. So I think that's my basic response to the issues that were raised there.
Thanks, Rick. Itamar, do you have any others in the chat?
Oh, I see Grace is putting in the chat, maps.org/safety. We are committed to trying to provide as safe an environment as possible for the patients. It's the essence of therapy is creating a safe space. And so that's something that we hold very highly, and we're doing whatever we can to do that. And we also have various information at the FAQ about more specific responses to some of the things that were said.
Okay,
that was a good answer. The only thing that I would ask is, in a world after MDMA approval, how would a therapist kind of manage the depth and pacing of MDMA therapy?
Well, it's a good question. So I mentioned expanded access, that we have approval for 50 patients in expanded access. The fundamental difference between the expanded access protocol and the phase 3 design is that in phase 3 is 3 MDMA sessions 1 month apart. It's basically 3.5 months of treatment. In the expanded access, we've made it into 8 months so that there can be more time between sessions if people need more time to integrate. Also, in research, we pay for it all, but post-approval, people are paying for it themselves. So I think it's really, oh, what did I do there? Oh, there we go. Sorry. In research, it's very rigorous, but and similar, but in therapy, it will be up to the patients and the therapist to figure out the pacing of, the emerging material. We did have, I said we had 6.5% dropouts. In phase 2, I think we had two people that I know of that dropped out because they weren't really ready to fully integrate it before the second session came around, and that they wanted more time, but we couldn't give them more time. So I think it's up to the skill of the therapist and the patient to feel that at what pace that they want to proceed. And it doesn't have to be as constrained as it is in the phase 3 study.
Okay, so we have another question here around MAPS claiming no suicidal thoughts on the study and the participants when cover story laid out that wasn't the case. There's a concern that MAPS is excluding data that would tarnish the study. Can you respond to that?
No, not true. Yeah, I don't know what data they're talking about. I mean, we have requested that all those people in cover story tell us, complete the long-term follow-up. We're not trying to exclude data. We want to know what's really going on here. And, we made a conscious choice to include people that have previously attempted suicide in our studies. And we're not aware of a single person in any of our studies that has succeeded in committing suicide. And the only suicide attempts that we're aware of are people that were in the placebo group. So no, we are trying our very best to honestly report the data.
Okay. So this is a question from Alex Klein. Psychedelics often have the potential to offer new and unexpected insights, sometimes going beyond what the conventional mind finds easy to grasp. Yet things like ethics and legal boundaries necessitate boundaries that are as clear and unambiguous as possible. How do you grapple with that apparent tension?
I don't really understand the question. The tension, people have unusual experiences. So maybe let's say that people, if this gets at the question, sometimes people might say, oh, I remember this sexual abuse that I experienced when I was 3 or 4. Is that real or is that not? I mean, did it really happen or did it not really happen? From a therapeutic point of view, it doesn't really matter. It's symbolic or it's real, but we help people process the emotions of it. So, confused, let's say somebody says, oh, I was abducted by an alien or something like that. But they're still feelings that are important. So whether it was true or not is more, it's a separate question than what do we do in a therapeutic setting to try to facilitate that processing. So we encourage people to experience and express whatever has happened, whether or not it, quote, was real. So, and that can be examined afterwards, but in the therapeutic setting, when these unusual experiences happen, we encourage people to just explore and experience and express rather than suppress. So I think that's the fundamental difference, is that what's emerging, we have this idea of the inner healing intelligence, that there's this, we all know that our bodies heal themselves. There's this urge for self-healing, for wholeness, but we think there's something similar in the psyche. So whatever is emerging at any particular time, we try to support that. Our method is inner directed. It's not scripted like it can be with cognitive processing therapy or prolonged exposure in a sense. It's more whatever emerges is what we support people to experience.
Okay. Itamar, are you getting any questions?
Different. Yeah, I've got a different kind of question, which might be interesting to ask. A little bit of a contrafactual historically. Where do you think you and MAPS would be right now, progress-wise, had MDMA not been outlawed in the 1980s and scheduled?
Well, we would have worked on LSD or something else, but because we're committed to psychedelic medicine. But if MDMA had not been scheduled in '85, the important question is not where would MAPS and me be, but where would the world be? Where would the amount of trauma be? as I said before, just think about how many people have committed suicide since '85, where I think MDMA could help. One of the it's a tragedy. We'd be working on Ibogaine, we'd be working on MDMA, but I think that if MDMA had not been criminalized, there would be thousands, 6,000 or 7,000 clinics right now with people trained to administer MDMA. We would have had a lot more stories of psychedelic healings that would have led to more funding, to more research for LSD and Ibogaine and mescaline and all these things. So I think we would be further advanced towards this psychedelic utopia legalization world that I'm hoping will happen over time.
So another question here from Kevin Madden. What specific therapeutic skills or techniques would you suggest developing to trainees who may be interested in psychedelic assisted therapy as a component of future practice?
Well, I think the most important thing is your own experience with psychedelics. So I would suggest people go through their own therapy. And then from that, there's a Jungian archetype called the wounded healer. The person that has healed themselves of their own wounds now has learned how to help other people in a deeper way. So I think the first part of that is have your own experiences. Another part of this has to do with, I wouldn't say meditation, but this ability to be quiet while it's an 8-hour session. And during an 8-hour MDMA session with two therapists, usually male, female, on average, varies quite a bit, but on average, around half the time, people's eyes are closed. They're looking inward. They're having this poetic, metaphorical experiences, but they're not speaking to the therapist. The other half of the time, they're speaking to the therapist. So the therapists need a lot of skill to just be there quietly attentive to what's going on with the person, but not interfering. If people are quiet around every hour, they'll check in and just see how they're doing, see if they want to talk. And then the other part is that you don't want to be triggered by what people are telling you. I mean, sometimes, Michael and Annie talk about how, driving home in their car, they just had to start crying to hear the stories of what people had happened to them. But they saved it for later. If you are triggered yourself during the time that the patients are telling you things, it's hard for you to be there for them. So that gets back to doing your own work. The other part is just, I think there's a lot to be learned about the different therapeutic approaches and how to speak to patients, how not to lead them, but to support them. We don't use guided imagery. Guided imagery can be helpful. We haven't yet used VR. VR could be helpful, but I think the skill that people have is to be able to listen carefully to sort of hints that people might give about deeper issues that they may. A lot of times in therapy, people will sort of gloss over something and they'll say it. And what really is going on is they're wanting to see if the therapist is willing to go there as well with them. And so I think that kind of listening, but I think all the different kind of therapies you could learn would be very helpful. Although there is a lot of unlearning, very much unlearning, in terms of letting people have their own experience. Michael and Annie have talked about this idea of wait, WAIT. And what that means is, why am I talking? So that there's just a lot of silences and you want people to be able to fill them up, with their own inner explorations or speak when they want to. So I think patience, meditation, your own experiences, those were all good skills. But also I'd recommend the treatment manual. So if you really want to understand our therapeutic approach, you just go to the website and look at the treatment manual that describes our therapeutic approach. And then that'll give you a clue as to what skills are you might want to learn.
So I got one question here from Wally Khan. During an ethical IP panel, Doblin said that though MAPS has had an anti-patent strategy, it is still deciding whether or not it is ideologically opposed to patenting. Has the position changed since then?
Oh, no. We're not ideologically opposed to patenting, no. I think, as I said before, if you're patenting original ideas, that's what the patent system is for. We've had, as I said, 130 million or so in grants and donations. We're raising another 70 million. These are very expensive studies. And with patents, for-profit companies are able to raise a lot of money. But it also rewards people who are inventors. So no, we're not opposed to patents. We're opposed to overbroad patents. What's sort of traditional in the pharma industry is you patent a lot of things, even things that you may not have really invented, and then you rely on your money and your lawyers to drain other people of money for fees for their lawyers. And so often they say that the people who have the most money for the lawyers are the ones that win the patent fights. But I think that's inappropriate for the way psychedelic medicine should develop. But I do think patents are fine as long as they're based on original inventions. We don't want to, I feel that the need to move psychedelics into the mainstream and to use them for healing purposes is so great that that's why we're for legalization. And also why we've chosen not to patent anything, but we will use the data exclusivity.
Itamar, do you have any on your end? Okay, let's see. Scanning. What are your recent thoughts on the way recently emerged ketamine clinics in the US are operating in regards to efficacy in treating mental health issues such as depression and cost and access to the public?
Well, ketamine is a good example of a profit maximization rather than patient outcome maximization. Ketamine was made into a medicine without therapy. The pharma company, Johnson & Johnson, Janssen, owned by Johnson & Johnson, they patented an isomer of ketamine. That isomer is no better and is not as good, I don't think, as the racemic generic version of ketamine, but they could patent it. And then, because they don't understand anything about therapy, they have made it into a medicine without therapy. Now, you know, electroconvulsive therapy doesn't come along with psychotherapy. I can understand why they did that, but I think it's suboptimal. So I think more and more of the ketamine clinics are not buying Spravato from Johnson & Johnson, but are buying the generic ketamine, the racemic version that's only a few dollars, and they're combining it with therapy. So I think over time, what we're going to see is those ketamine clinics that are just offering a pharmacological treatment without therapy, as we bring along MDMA, as other groups bring along psilocybin, what's going to survive is going to be the clinics that have people cross-trained in the multiple different psychedelics available and that provide therapy. I think that the clinics that just provide ketamine in a pharmacological model without talking are over time going to fade away. We received a $5.25 million donation from in Bitcoin from an early cryptocurrency guy. And what he said is that he had gone to receive ketamine for borderline personality disorder and depression. And he had this insight under the influence of ketamine that the way to get out of his problems was to help other people. And he wanted to talk to the therapist about that. But they said, we don't care. They weren't really therapists. They said, we don't care about your internal content. It doesn't have anything to do with the outcomes. It's just this pharmacological effect that's going to have on your brain. And don't talk to us about it. And he was really upset about that. Later on, that idea of helping other people still made sense to him. And so he put a little line in Reddit about how he's going to give away $88 million worth of Bitcoin. And we got $5.25. And the reason that he said he wanted to give that to us is because we combined MDMA with therapy. And he thought that ketamine should have been combined with therapy. So I think that over time, that's what's going to happen is those clinics that don't provide ketamine are going to fade away. I mean, don't provide therapy with ketamine are going to fade away.
Great. So I think we got maybe one more. Itamar, did you have one you wanted to share?
I do have one. I think it's a good one. It's from Lauren Enton. She asks, have any of your research populations contained individuals with comorbid diagnoses like anxiety and depression in addition to their PTSD? If so, how do you find they navigate that experience with MDMA in terms of neurotoxicity or alterations in their brain chemistry? Have you seen any of these people with those comorbidities enter into something like a post-MDMA depression? And how do you suggest that? And would you suggest anything? And how does research support people who can go into a low or a blue mode after an MDMA session?
Yeah, well, I would say that what we do not really believe that there's any neurotoxicity taking place at the doses that we're giving, first off. Almost everybody that has PTSD also has depression. So we definitely have comorbidities there. Ben Sessa in England did a study with alcohol use disorder and ended up finding that almost everybody there had unresolved trauma, and you help them resolve the trauma, and then they don't need to run away with alcohol. And he's got pretty good results there. But the FDA has not permitted us to work with people with comorbid substance abuse yet. But there is no way to really separate out depression from PTSD and work with a pure PTSD population who's not depressed. We are very much the view this idea of the blue Mondays and things like that. We actually don't see that in our therapeutic setting. And I think one of the reasons is that we do the MDMA therapy during the day. We have, for most places, overnight stays so people can rest. We have more integrative psychotherapy the next day, and they rest the next day. We don't suggest that people take 5-HTP or anything like that. And one of the biggest things maybe to answer that question is that we do require people to withdraw from their psychiatric medicines before they can take MDMA. And that tapering process can sometimes take months. And that's a very difficult aspect of it. But the SSRIs blunt the effects of MDMA. And we actually want people's we want them to basically be able to have more support if they need it, so people can have additional integrative sessions if they need it. People do process a lot of stuff, but we don't see this kind of low mood. And we think that over time, we are interested in doing a study that would be people who are depressed without PTSD. That would be an interesting thing that we want to do.
We got any more time, Dan, or?
Maybe time for one more. I have one that was kind of interesting. In the MAPS protocol, there seems to be a large amount of flexibility given to therapists as compared to a CBT or DBT protocol, for example. It puts a lot of trust in therapist ability, even if it's just to let the medicine work. Do you have a preferred model for ensuring that that trust is not misplaced? How do we set ethical guidelines here?
Well, it's very, we have a treatment manual. We supervise people, and we have adherence raters that give feedback. I think that we don't want to say that people must do our treatment manual exactly. They can add elements of things that they find to be useful, like if they want to do cognitive behavioral, some sort of things. There's actually a really interesting paper that Michael Mithofer wrote in the MAPS bulletin about how elements of other psychotherapies can find their way into the MDMA session. Prolonged exposure is sort of imaginal recollection of the trauma. And that happens a lot in PTSD, but it happens spontaneously. There's elements of correcting people's cognitions. They think, for example, if somebody gets assaulted by somebody in a red hat, and every time they see a red hat, that makes them think they're about to be assaulted, but then you can separate it out. And so there's a lot of that kind of cognitive work. There's aspects of it, but we think that therapists should not be bound to do a particular method. And I think the fact that it seems to us that we haven't done direct comparisons, but most of the people in our studies have had prior therapies that have still left them with PTSD, that there needs to be different modalities. And I think that within the kind of therapy that we do, having that flexibility is better, because what we're talking about is this inner healing intelligence, what emerges. I think that there's, challenges in ethics with psychotherapy, with psychiatry, with all of that. And so we're going to be having a very, robust patient bill of rights, people where they can complain, things like that. But I think, it's a challenge, but I think standardizing a method that's still open-ended and permits the therapist to use their best judgment of what to say or do is better than some of these more rigid, so for example, the CAPS 5 and prolonged exposure, you have what's called an index trauma. And that's the real trauma, the most important trauma, the index trauma. And you're not supposed to talk about other traumas. I think it's very much limiting. A lot of times people have layers, the archaeology of trauma. So I think, sticking to one particular trauma is not in the best interest of the patient. So I think a lot of people also with prolonged exposure, they or cognitive processing therapy, even that, it's overwhelming, the trauma, and they drop out of the treatments, as I showed you with the dropout rates. So having this ability for people to maneuver on their own is much better.
Great. Thanks, Rick. So I think that's all the time we have today. Thanks everyone for joining. We'll be posting the talk on YouTube, and stay tuned for other updates. All right. Bye-bye.